The next speaker I'm going to introduce is a man who needs no introduction, but I think it's important that we probably do that. He's a Kenyan lawyer and a political scientist, a crusading intellectual with a merited acclaim as a sobering political analyst, and he has proven that. He also gave us a very good anecdote. Remember, the Azimio cows, if people remember that, who said they'll be milked dry. He's a seasoned consultant and advisor. He has over 16 years experience in governance and democracy, constitutional law, political parties, elections in Africa, constitutional law, public policy, political communication strategy. He has a background that spans IGOs, NGOs, private sector, and constitutional commissions. He's none other than Javas Bigambo, and he's a gifted political strategist and research specialist. He has managed various projects and his works have been published in the field. He is a remarkable person who has an ability to navigate the interplay between law, governance, public policy, and politics. I would like to welcome Javas to the podium and thank you so much. Welcome, Javas.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the invitation to come here, especially looking at the galaxy of governance enthusiasts here and the slate of speakers. I felt so much humbled by this invitation. And as we get to reflect on a couple of issues that have been spoken about since the time that we gathered here, I would like to invite us to open the toolbox of thought and pick out the spanners of ideas to help Mizani Africa see how to push the issues about governance forward, because forward is where we need to move. For the purpose of this conversation today, I have settled and selected recalibrating the youth for purposive governance as the subject for my discussion. Recalibrating the youth for purposive governance in Kenya. And I'll speak briefly on this subject. Issues of youth have been canvassed for a very long time, here in Kenya, in Africa, and globally. And when you look at it, you realize that in the granary of history, there is so much that we can talk about the youth. There are far too many youth that can serve as practical, dead, and even living examples. And how some have excelled, where some of us or some countries have successfully failed. In Africa, Africa recognizes the place and the importance of youth. When you look at the African Youth Charter, it provides, of course, the definition that is tethered to the UN definition of youth, being individuals from the age or between the ages of 15 to 35. And when you look at even Africa Agenda 2063, provides that the youth are the vertebral column of the achievement of this vision, Africa 2063. But what are we doing so far in appreciating the place of youth in governance, in politics, etc.? When you look at it, you realize that in this country of ours, 80% of the population nearly constitutes the youth, with about 13 million being adolescents. When you look at Africa's population, you realize that majority of the population of Africa constitutes the youth. In fact, we all know that in the next 2 decades or so, every 2 births in 5 around the world will be people on this continent. So Africa is the continent of the future. But when you look at nearly the 54 countries in Africa, are the youth really purposive participants in the sphere of governance? If not, why? How do we appreciate their contribution in all these spaces of governance? Or how do we appreciate their failure within these spaces? Now, my mind this evening is fertilized by the great history of younger people around the world and even in this country who've done so much for the country and that we can celebrate. Globally, of course, across the Pacific, we think of individuals like Thomas Jefferson, whose contribution to the democratization of the constitutional struggles of America it can never be forgotten of the epic words, all men are created equal. He was 34 at the time. Here in Kenya, people like Thomas Mboya, when he was only 28, he had graced the cover of the Time magazine. At 28, he was a celebrated trade unionist. 28, he had been invited to the White House by J.F. Kennedy. When you look at Africa, people like Thomas Mboya, by the time he had not even left the bracket of youth, he had become president of Burkina Faso and had made the world to appreciate that women hold the other pillars, half of the pillars of the sky of the world. He was still a youth. In DRC, we had Patrice Emery Lumumba. In his youth, to this date, history cannot forget him. People like Stephen Bantu Biko of South Africa, Nelson Mandela, Winnie Madikizela Mandela, they've done so much, and I know we all celebrate them. In their times, the history of former times is replete of such great names. But even in the present moments in which we live, we know other great younger people who joined politics and governance in their youth, in their prime, and still they are celebrated. Think of people like Dr. Mbuiseni Nlozi in South Africa. Think of people like Robert Chagulanyi, Sentamu, alias Bobby Wine, across in Uganda, sacrificing for their own country. Here, even our very own Raila Odinga joined politics when he was still young. And perhaps even some of the names that have been mentioned here, who've joined politics when they are young or in their youth, but perhaps they cannot even find a place in the footnotes of celebration of their contribution to society's progress. So in the prime of youth, there is so much to gain, there is so much to lose. Some of the things that have been canvassed here by speakers who are more able and more eloquent than myself, who preceded me, are things that younger people can pick and run away with to make Kenya a great country. In the most recent times, we've had lots of advocacy, for example, about the issue of the insufficiency or lack of sanitary pads, keeping many girls out of schools. And then I ask myself, this thing is affecting the youth who constitute close to 80% of the Kenyan population, and yet we have not even moved motions to say that, for example, just 1.5% of the annual budget will go to procuring sanitary pads for schools for women across the country. Things that we can do. When we budget for corruption, why can't we, younger people, budget for the inclusion of younger people and make sure that we keep every girl in school? Things we can do. But where do we fail? Because we have not come here in a festival of lamentations, but a festival of reflections. Look at our political system. Through Article 38 of the Constitution, provides secures and shelters political rights for everyone, every citizen. Participate, join, form a political party, advocate for an idea. When you look at Section 6, subsection 2 of the Political Parties Amendment Act 2022, provides that each political party should have an ideology. Now, when we hurtled to the 2022 general election, we had 84 political parties registered in this country. 84. I am sure the heads gathered here cannot number half of the parties that went to the general election last year. 84. Of the 84, if I were to ask or task each of us to mention the ideology of any political party in this country, I am sure our failure will be very successful. And so the issue is that while we look at youth and their participation in governance, as well as youth and their participation in political parties, because political parties are instruments of democracy and governance, then we realize that our failure begins in our political formations. Because it's political parties that, upon success, whether individually or with coalitions, get to form government. So, do we have ideologies in this country? When you look at even the composition, the structure of political parties, for example, we've got the national executive committees. Do youth have a place in these committees? And if they do, did they work their way there? or they are there merely to do somebody else's bidding. The leaders or the founders of those parties. That is the other challenge, the decision-making organ of political parties. The other thing is this: are political parties nurturing younger leaders, young talents, etc.? But beyond that nurturing, are younger people, the youth, or the youthful people, availing themselves for this nurturing? Because I ask myself, who prompted Eli Likuyani to start an advocacy for governance and take the front seat? Who prompted Sir Amadou Bello of Sokoto to stand up for Sokoto and fight for it? Who prompted Steve Bantu Biko to stand up for South Africa, or even Winnie Madikizela Mandela to fight for ANC and South Africans? Who prompted her? Self. So in this country of ours, are younger people prompting the self, the inner self, to participate effectively in the spaces of governance? Or do they find comfort under the shelter of being tent directors and goons, hired goons for that matter, for political leaders within political parties? I say this because I'm thinking about the Isiolo massacre. I'm thinking about the Kisumu massacre. I'm thinking about the Garissa massacre. I'm thinking about the Wagala massacre. In fact, quite shamefully, I'm thinking about the post-election violence of 2007. But beyond that, I'm thinking about the genocide in Rwanda in 1994. I am thinking about the Gukuruhandi massacre in 1982 in Zimbabwe among the Shona people. I'm thinking about the marauding gangs of Haiti. I'm thinking about the leadership and composition of Boko Haram in Nigeria. You realize one thing in common: they are led, driven, sustained by the youth. Here in this country of ours, look at the character of each political party. The youth are the center of chaos. They are ready to be used for mobilization as in fact terrorists, organized terrorists against the opponents. Think about what happened to Margaret Langat in ODM. Think about even how political parties organize party primaries. And then you realize that when young people who are billed as the future of a country become the enablers of today's emptiness, then the future governance of even our own country and counties is doomed. Now, look at it this way. How do we expect young people to participate in governance quite effectively when they are strangers to the contents of the Constitution, policies, and statutes in our own country? Let me ask a question to all of you seated here, majority of you being young, perhaps younger than myself, and all of us perhaps being within the same bracket. How many of us here have read the annual reports from the Office of the Auditor General? How many of us seated here read reports from the Control of Budget? How many of us seated here interact even just superficially with the website of Kenya Bureau of Statistics? How many of us here read committee reports in Parliament or county assemblies? In fact, do you know that at the county assembly level, and I've been consulting for various county assemblies as much, you realize that functionally illiterate people populate county assemblies across the 47 counties. Functionally illiterate. And they do not interrogate even the reports of the Auditor General, reports of the constitutional commissions. They don't. So if leaders who are elected and nominated don't, and if the youth in this country don't, how can we possibly, progressively, consciously, and effectively participate in governance? Because that is the starting point from where I stand. That is the starting point. In fact, if I was to bet anything to the last breath that I have, that here among us who read even last year's Auditor General's report, I am sure I'll leave this place a very rich man. because I will win the bet and you will lose it. So the thing is, as young people, why can't we just consciously engage with issues? When my relative was talking about the issue of the National Wealth Fund, the Sovereign Fund, majority of us here in this room were vacuous about not just that fund itself, but even how to move ahead with this thing. And yet, we get angry when we check the headlines of the newspapers that State House requisitioned for about R1 billion for innovation. But we don't read audit reports. Now, how many of us even here participate in budget-making processes at the county level? Just this week that's ended, the CS for Education, Dr. Mashogu, published in the dailies about 9 pieces of draft legislations, bills for that matter, that are supposed to affect the education sector, including sessional policy reform paper 2024. How many of us have even acquainted, even remotely, with these documents? We are young people. Then how can we say that we are conscious agitators for good governance wherever we are, or in this country? Patriots we are, yes. Lovers and charmers we are. But we are totally estranged to issues of real governance and real politique. And that is why it is easy for us, the moment we find ourselves in the electioneering period and have got to vote, we are tempted, and in fact, it is so magnetic. We are attracted to the vacuous, intellectually inept, morally vacuous leaders and become, in fact, we find them anathemic persons who have got integrity, who've got clean records, who can take our country forward. And that is why even the president who will shortly speak after me here could not gain traction in this country for his presidential bid. But any person who has got serious mud to his name, any person with dubious wealth, we find them so attractive that even the angels would envy us. And that is the issue that is so disturbing about the youth. The other thing is that even younger people, the moment they get to parliament, the first desire that they have is acquisition of wealth. The allure of wealth. What can we do to clean up our politics, clean up our governance, but clean up ourselves too, sanitize our minds? I remember as I moved towards the end, I would say this, that I remember after you finished university, I got an opportunity to work at a rights-based organization that was dealing with persons with disability. And after about a year, we were supposed to write a report so that one of our donors would grant us about 10 million shillings, Kenyan shillings, for the next year's project. We had not done much the previous year, and I declined to write the report. My salary at the time was 35,000 shillings before tax. The head of the organization 2 days later called me and said, Javas, there is an envelope here. In fact, I saw with my own 4 eyes. Some of you have got only 2. 4 eyes, 100,000 shillings. Write the report, this money is yours. At that time, in fact, I could not even wear cologne. I was stinking like a lion. At that time, I could not even have a decent shirt on my back. My shoes, you'd think it was a triangle, because they were slanting to the side. I thought about it. I saw close to 3 months' salary and more here after just writing a report. And well, God's blessed me with good writing skills as well. The following day, I tendered my resignation. I didn't take it up. 4 years later, I met the guy, and he said, I like the kind of young man you are. But why is it that you wanted me to falsify a report, and then 4 years later you think I'm a great guy? We are a pretentious nation for self-gain. So unless we make the issues of governance personal, Unless we make choices personal, we will not move far. The last example I would say is this. Part of the peripheral discussions I've been having with my friend Eli out there. Do you know that even in this city, tonight as we're seated here, we are seated in one of the most inequitable cities in the world. Discriminatory cities in the world and countries. Do you know that when we go to vote, and Article 81 of the Constitution talks about the principles of fair elections, and Article 88 provides for the IBC and the work it's supposed to do. Imagine that as you go to pick your sole loser of a candidate for governor because he's corrupt, or because of tribal arithmetic, persons who are visually impaired cannot choose their own candidate independently. Why can't we have even a ballot paper in Braille, so that a person who is visually impaired can go vote without assistance? These things we can do. These things we must do. Because the Constitution provides that Parliament should avail sufficient funding for constitutional commissions, including IEBC. IEBC should have enough funding to provide for independent voting for persons who are visually impaired. The other thing is this. I had a very nasty experience a few months ago. Had some Nigerians visiting, and we had to pay a courtesy call to the governor of Nairobi. And when they had arrived, one of the guests who was physically disabled could not go to the governor's office through the VIP area because there is no elevator, no even ramp. At the center of the city, 6 decades after independence. Why are we pretentious? Why do we hate some of our fellow citizens like this? And so, I would say, like I said earlier, it's not a festival of lamentations, but I think that this conference is the beginning point of conversation. That's why I talked about picking out of the toolbox of thought, spanners of ideas with which we can now start turning the works. And Eli and team, let's do this, not just for Mizani, not just for Wistawi, not just for Nairobi, but for this country. My grandfather Samson told me, Javas Arafat Bigambo, whenever you attend a meeting, make sure that that meeting does not end before you speak. If this meeting ends right now, I have spoken. Now, casting our faith to him who created us, ladies and gentlemen, steadfast as we must be, let us fight the good fight, because the race is ours to win. I thank you.